It's the Whiskey Wizard.
Hello and welcome to the Whiskey Wizard, where we say that whiskey making takes scientific knowledge, an artisan's skill and dedication, and a bit of the wizard's alchemy of light, air, earth, and fire. Okay, in this installment, we're talking about wheated bourbon. Some may wonder, what is a wheated bourbon anyway? Well, wheated bourbon is a subset of the bourbon category of American whiskeys. As a note, there is no requirement for the distiller to note on the bottle that it's a wheated bourbon. So what about all these wheated bourbons and why are they popular? Many novice and experienced drinkers associate these wheated whiskeys with having a mellow, smooth drinkability. First, I guess we should discuss as a reminder what bourbon is, as we do have a legal description. It must consist of at least 51% corn, and it must use newly charred American oak barrels for the maturation process. And it can be no more than 80% alcohol. Most often, bourbon distillers use rye and malted barley in varying proportions to comprise the other 49% of the mash bill. So cool. Now with a wheated bourbon, our distillers simply replace the rye with wheat, either in whole or in part. Most, I'll call it standard bourbons people are seeking today, are about 60 to 80% corn, 10 to 20% rye, and 4 to 12% malted barley. Again, for a wheated mash bill, they swap the wheat for the rye. At the end of the day, a wheated bourbon still meets all of the fundamental requirements for being a bourbon, and yet they tend to have their own distinct flavor. With rye, usually as the second most abundant grain in bourbon, it inherits some of the rye's bold, spicy, dry range of flavors on the palate. By comparison, wheat has a much milder flavor profile than the rye, which softens down the edges a bit, giving it a softer expression that one might refer to as smooth. Corn is inherently sweet, and it works with wheat's own sweet character, but in a synergistic way that lets the sweetness assert without being overly cloying. Bourbon distillers commonly use more corn than the 51% minimum corn requirement, and this is to tone down the boldness of the rye. If wheat is used in place of rye, distillers don't have to use quite as much corn. Many assert that this adds complexity to the somewhat sweeter notes that are present. The softer wheat lets other flavors through, such as the esters released to the spirit from wood aging, like fruit, floral, toffee, and honey notes, along with the usual flavors from the barrel like oak and vanilla. All this, when done right, can result in a very intricate, perhaps delicate flavor profile. With its complex range of subtle flavors and its sweet, soft profile, wheated bourbon is a great introduction drink for someone wanting to stick their toe in the bourbon world. A bit more about this. You may know that malting a grain releases the enzymes that nature designed to feed the germinating seed, and instead we use them for setting us up for fermentation. To malt a grain, it is usually steeped in warm moisture while the grain is softly mixed and turned. Once germination starts, the grain is then dried to stop the process before sprouting occurs. With fruit sugars, yeast will naturally break down the sugars into alcohol. However, when trying to ferment grains, the long starch molecules are not amenable yet to fermentation. The starches must be broken down into simpler sugars to be fermentable. So after malting, the yeast will be able to deal with the more digestible sugars, and through the miracle of biochemistry, create alcohol. Malted barley and some other grains have enough enzymes to break down their own starches and other starches in the mash as well. Malting wheat is almost impossible due to its elasticity. Wheat can be toasted to create what is known as a chocolate wheat. I wouldn't be surprised to see this showing up in someone's new whiskey release sometime in the future. While wheat makes a great ingredient in making dough, it is much more difficult to malt because it creates a thick mash that plugs up the stools. However, wheat is one of the most harvested crops globally and is usually readily available. With the addition of malted barley to the mash bill, the starches in the wheat can still be broken down. Rye was initially used as the flavoring grain in whiskey in places like Maryland, Western Pennsylvania, and Kentucky because farmers in those areas grew rye over wheat due to its greater resistance to blight and other diseases. Wheat recently became popular as a flavoring grain by distillers who were looking to set themselves apart. You do get the spicier flavors like clove, nutmeg, and pepper with rye. Therefore, many mash bills now have a mix of rye and wheat. In this hybrid combination, you still get some of the spiciness of the rye while letting the sweetness come through, giving the nose and palate a lot of depth. As a note, a growing number of distillers are experimenting with more exotic grains like quinoa, buckwheat, rice, oats, and sorghum. Wheated bourbon has become wildly popular due to its easy drinking profile, and they comprise some of the most popular or sought-after whiskeys today, such as Pappy Van Winkle, Maker's Mark, including Private Select, Weller Antique, 1792 Sweet Wheat Bourbon, Old Fitzgerald, Redemption Wheated Bourbon, Rebel Yell 100, Garrison Brothers Texas Straight Bourbon Whiskey, to name just a few of these. So a wheated bourbon is a great choice for someone looking to experience their first bourbon. And as we said, the sweeter taste will allow anyone to enjoy the more subdued notes present, with a softer flavor profile while experience yet another facet of bourbon, thus expanding your palate. Well, that's all for this week's Whiskey Wizard. Make sure to catch me, Doug Dunbar, with the rest of the Whiskey Roundtable crew, Big G and Karen Helen Keller, on our live Whiskey Roundtable show on YouTube this coming Friday night starting at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. You can also find a link to that Friday's show on our Facebook page. You won't want to miss it, as we'll be having folks in from our favorite local distiller to share one of their wheated bourbons with us, and they have some special news to share about it. Cheers and Slanjava. Remember, think responsibly.